Thank you very much for this kind introduction. General, Commandant, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big privilege to be with you this morning as, I think, a friendly alien in this room. This is also the closest I've ever been to the Air Force, any Air Force in the world, in 44 years. As an officer cadet, I was posted to Iraq in 1975, just a couple of years before Saddam Hussein came to power. And I was attached to the Soviet, Soviet Military Assistance Group that helped train the Iraqi pilots to fly the MiG-23B aircraft. So that's the closest I ever got. I spent a year there between Fallujah and Ramadi. It's just the cities that were of no importance in the towns, that were of no importance in those days, but that have since become fairly famous for the wrong reason. Talking about the Air Force, there's another thing I cannot help not share with you. There are some people in this room who probably have heard the name of General Curtis LeMay, who, of course, was the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force in the early 1960s. Now, when LeMay was listening to an officer briefing him about the state of the world, he interrupted the officer when he mentioned the Soviet Union as an enemy. He said, "Wrong. The Soviet Union is an adversary. The Navy is the enemy." Well, this comes from an Army man, as you can understand. Well, one takeaway from the first day of discussion and this morning that I will be thinking about is that with all the documents on the table after the end of the Cold War, we are pretty confident that during the 40 years of very serious confrontation, neither side, not the United States and NATO, not the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, were contemplating a premeditated attack against the other. And that, I think, is important given that deterrence, by its very nature, commanded both blocs to show both their willingness and their capability to give a robust military response to any act of aggression. And since both sides were posturing, there have been a few moments, or there were a few moments during the Cold War when I think we were saved by a stroke of luck or two. I think this is something that we need to remember as we enter another period of confrontation, which is there, which will not go away for a number of years, maybe a number of decades, and the outcome of which, at least, I cannot see at this point. I think there's been a slight misunderstanding. I'm not going to talk about, I'm not a fan of the multipolar world. In fact, the phrase was suggested to me by the organizers on the thinking, I believe, that this is the official Soviet or Russian, now Russian position. I have a slightly different view of what the world is and what the world order is. But let me focus on Russia, because this is what I've been asked to do, and this, I think, is immensely important for the reason I just given, that we do not misconceive, that we do not misunderstand, that we do not, we are not led by our own image of the adversary, whereas the adversary thinks in a totally different way. For example, all the doctrines and strategies developed by NATO over the course of several decades in the Cold War were based on the Western thinking on both sides. There is no certainty to claim that the Soviet Union would have responded to NATO's first use in the way that NATO thought it would. This is something that we need to remember. And too often, when we think about the others, we have a certain view developed by ourselves, and this view does not often match. And that applies both to the Russians and the non-Russians. 5 years ago, Russia's foreign policy took a very sharp turn. I would say it was an end of an era. There were two pillars that the Russian Federation based its foreign policy on since the collapse of the Soviet Union. One was Russia's integration into an extended West, and I would add in the same breath, on Russia's terms. And second was reintegration of the former republics of the Soviet Union, or the former borderlands of the Russian Empire, into a Russo-centric power center in Eurasia. Both those pillars collapsed at the same time and in the same place. The time was 2014. The place was Ukraine. For a period of time, it looked like Russia did not have much of a strategy to follow after the collapse of those two pillars. And there was no plan C, because what happened in Ukraine in 2014 was as much a surprise to Vladimir Putin and the Russian establishment as it was for most of you, I think, as it was for me. I don't think that Putin welcoming 2014 on his dacha or wherever he was drinking a toast to a Russian Crimea. He certainly was not. The thing that preoccupied him at that time was the Sochi Olympics. And when things were happening in Kiev, he was, in fact, hosting the Olympics, and that was his main concern. For a period of time, it looked like with Plan B and Plan C, Plan A and Plan B were were no longer relevant. The only Plan C available to Russia would be a plan where C would stand for China. They were very uninformed, again, thinking about perceptions, uninformed view among a portion of the Russian elite who knew nothing about China. And anyone who talks about China not having first mastered the language and the culture and so many other things should be listened with a lot of caution. And they thought that China would jump at the opportunity, since China was in this growing competition with the United States and Russia was there for the asking. So China would step in, China would replace Europe and the United States for Russia. Of course, China did not, for the reasons that I think we all understand, the reasons that were given in yesterday's presentation on China. But this moment of confusion lasted perhaps a year. First of all, the Russians did not understand, the Russian leadership did not understand that what happened in Crimea put an end on Russia's relations with the West, the way those relations had formed since the end of the Cold War. Many of them, even in the summer of 2014, were thinking that it's another Georgia. The West will protest, the West will make statements, but essentially it's not a major Western concern. and we will have we will bracket Ukraine, just like we bracketed Georgia. But this was not to be, for reasons that some understood and some did not understand immediately. As a result, Russia finds itself in a very new situation, which is not so unfamiliar to Russia. Russia has pivoted away from Europe and the West. It has not become the West of the East. It has not merged with China. It has pivoted to itself. So Russia today is clearly not Europe, clearly not Asia. It's Russia. And there's no Eurasia that Russia used to control. That's no longer available. This is a big geopolitical repositioning in which, for the first time since Peter the Great, meaning 300 years plus, Russia is no longer looking at Europe and the West as its mentor or its model. And it does not see itself as part of what even 8 years ago Putin proclaimed as a greater Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. This is all gone. This is a major rethink on the Russian part. And instead of being always looking at the West for good things and bad things, the invasions of Hitler, Napoleon, Charles XII, and some of the others, instead of looking at Europe as the part of the world where the sun of knowledge, the sun of humanity rises, Russia is adopting a view in which Europe is a neighbor. It's a neighbor to the West. There's a neighbor to the East, i.e. China and Japan and Korea. India, if you want to include India in that category. You look south and you see the Muslim world. So instead of always facing Europe and always turning one's back on Asia, you sit in a swivel chair and you look around the world. And of course, with the melting of the Arctic ice, you have a new facade emerging, and that facade also has security implications, foreign policy, economic, and other implications. So that is the new geopolitical position of Russia as a country in the middle of Greater Eurasia. This Greater Eurasia begins in Lisbon, and it goes all the way to Kamchatka. This is or Busan, or whatever place you want to, a non-Russian city you want to use for that purpose. Russia may be a regional power, but the region stretches from Norway to North Korea. It's quite a region. When the Russians look at the state of the world, they see the current disorder and the waning of American superpower as a transition to a new order. They call it multipolar. I think this is wrong for a variety of reasons. There are only two poles. You cannot have multiple poles. That's the easiest. But then you have different countries occupying, or different forces occupying different positions at different levels. It's far too diffuse. It's far too uncontrolled the way that it used to be controlled in the bipolar world or in the world run by the concert of Europe. With regard to the West, I think the Russians see double. There's confrontation with the United States. There's no confrontation with the West as such, or with Europe as such. The adversary is the U.S. That's how the Russian leadership sees it. And in the U.S.-Russian very asymmetrical rivalry or asymmetrical relationship, the shorthand to describe that relationship would be dominance versus autonomy. What the Russians insist upon is autonomy to take actions in defense of national security or in promotion of one's interests without having to look over their shoulder and ask for permission anywhere. And this is what they did in Crimea, and this is what they did in Donbass. For the United States, allowing Russia to do these things would be abdicating a major portion of the dominant position that the United States has held in the world. And that is unthinkable for very clear reasons. Russia's relations with Europe, I think, can be described as estrangement and mutual alienation. It's a different thing than confrontation. Russia does not see Europe as a military threat. Russia basically sees NATO the way it saw in the days of the Soviet Union as the United States in Europe. It's the United States that matters. Russia does not have a problem with Germany or Italy or Norway or France or many others. I don't think it has a problem with the Baltic states that would require going to war. I've always thought that the Baltic states are as safe today as they were, let's say, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. I don't think there's been any change. But I'm happy to be grilled on those questions, on those issues later on. With regard to the immediate neighborhood, I think what Russia has to admit is that it's not only the borderlands, the outlying regions. Who cares about Turkmenistan? Who cares about Tajikistan? Who cares about Georgia and Armenia? But the countries that used to form the core of the historical Russian state, but are splitting from Russia. And Ukraine, of course, is the most important of those countries. And I think that it's a difficult and painful and yet necessary process that the Russians will have to go through, admitting that Ukraine is not Russian, admitting that Ukraine will hitch its wagon to the other horse, not Russia's. I think over time they will have to think in the same way about Belarus. I hope that they do not, I hope that they will have learned the lesson of Ukraine, mishandling Ukraine over many years, from the standpoint of Russia's interest. I think Russia's policy vis-à-vis Ukraine was so bad prior to the crisis, prior to 2014, that its failure has cost Russia less than its success would have cost. Again, I can elaborate on that if you wish at some point. With China, that I think is the most important relationship for Russia going forward. Again, nothing will move in the US-Russia relationship. I think, and I've written about that, I think the US-Russia relationship has only one item on the agenda, and that item is avoiding military conflict. That's all. Nothing else is left on the agenda. With China, there are many question marks. There's a relationship that I call entente, which means much more than strategic partnership. There's a fair amount of commonality as far as the rejection of U.S. residual hegemony in the world, and a lot of other things. The liberal world order, where the rules are developed and decided upon within a small group of developed, large group of highly developed countries, and then imposed on the rest of the world. That is something that Russia clearly rejects and will continue to reject, like China. But in that entente, China is clearly the big boy. And Russia is certainly several times, 8 times in terms of the GDP, smaller than China. And since Russia insists, and will continue to insist, on being an independent player in the world, doesn't matter whether it's the United States or China, it will have to stand up to its own interests. So the China-Russia relationship will depend to a large degree on the wisdom of the Chinese leadership. The the Sino-Soviet alliance failed in the 1950s when the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev rejected the Chinese plea to be treated as a great power, a great communist power, but a great power nonetheless. For the Soviet Union, the Chinese were just like so many others, from Albania to Mongolia. And they did not have any special role. The Soviet Union did not have a deputy in the communist world. So Khrushchev said no. Then Mao did what Mao did, booting out the Russian advisors, Soviet advisors, and ending the relationship. Looking south, the Russians see a lot of turbulence from the Middle East to Afghanistan, and Russia has acted upon that. So in my world, the action in Ukraine, the Russian military action in Ukraine, was an action done in strategic defense. It was a proactive thing, but done in strategic defense to retain a buffer or to retain a base in Sebastopol, which otherwise would have had to be ceded to a potential adversary. It acted in the south, in Syria, not only in a proactive manner, but in an offensive manner. That was an act of strategic offense. What Russia wanted in Syria, I think, was to basically to be recognized as a world great power again. And it did get that. It's interesting, you're now talking about as a near-peer competitor. This near-peer competitor, which is something you did not hear 4 years or 5 years or 6 years ago. This near-peer competitor has a population which is 6 times smaller than the population of NATO countries, which has a defense budget which is 7% or 8% of the US defense budget, which has which has a GDP which is 1/8 of the GDP of the United States of America. And this is something that Russia has won through its action in Syria, when it basically stunned the world into doing something fairly successful so far, with the minimum forces, with the minimum expense of almost anything. I see Syria as a template for the 21st century Russian foreign policy. And let me just name a few key elements of that. Russia acts out of its own self-interest. Russia doesn't care about the world order, frankly. It only cares about its place in the world order. Similarly in Syria and the Middle East, it doesn't have a grand design for the region. There's no ideology behind Russia's actions. It's only the national interest as defined by the Kremlin. That is what Russia is, that's behind what Russia is doing out there. Second, there are no permanent allies in the region or anywhere. There are no permanent enemies. The Russians have learned in Afghanistan that your enemy of yesterday could be a very useful ally today. The Mujahideen, who booted out the Soviets from Afghanistan, half a decade later became indispensable in the fight against the Taliban. Today, the Taliban could be indispensable in the fight against ISIS, if ISIS ever rears its head in Afghanistan as the Americans move out. Russia maintains contact with all relevant players. They do not unrecognize anyone who is important. And they manage to maintain contacts simultaneously with mortal enemies, such as Iran and Israel. It's pretty amazing. It's very un-Soviet. And as I said, there's fairly small price that Russia has paid for that effort. Unlike the Soviet Union that walked around the world spending zillions of money for the lost cause of world communism, Russia is walking around the world trying to make money. And people are paying attention. So the Gulfies, who 10 years ago had not thought about Russia at all, it's totally unimportant, and are looking at Russia and are doing something with Russia. They have seen the United States abandon their ally of 30 years, Hosni Mubarak, on the 8th day of the Tahrir Square uprising. They've also watched Russia bail out Bashar al-Assad from a situation that was officially considered by nearly everyone who was seen as responsible in the West as a loser. And very finally, what's Russia's general ambition? I think it is to be a great power, but a great power by a different definition. It's not a GDP question. It's not the question how many capitals in the world raise your hand when you show the example. It is the ability to protect your independence, your security, and your very survival on your own. This is the definition of a great power from the Russian perspective. If you can do that, then you're a great power. Then you can do whatever you've decided to do. You will not have to watch over you don't have a senior ally, you don't have client states, you're very much by yourself. And basically, this is the reason why the basic reason why Russia's attempt to integrate into the West failed. Russia rejected buying the entry ticket to join the West. The entry ticket was and is recognizing U.S. leadership. Russia did not recognize U.S. leadership. It played with a loony notion of some sort of a joint leadership, which no one in his right mind in the United States would have agreed to. So Russia is a country that wants to be a great power, the definition that I have given, with a global reach. The world is, since you are all alone, you're not Europe, you're not Asia, you're not anything, you're not Slavic world. Who cares about the Slavic world in Russia? We're not Slavs. We're a mixture of many things. We spent a quarter millennium under the Mongols. We used to be part of Asia for 250 years. This is what distinguishes us from the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, something that many of my compatriots do not understand. That's the fault line. We adopted a lot of Asian ways, but we gained in strength, whereas others, they adopted many Eastern European ways, but they lost independence and are only now becoming formally independent, but wishing to become part of something bigger. And Russia is, I think the ambition is to become an indispensable player in Greater Eurasia, not the center of Greater Eurasia, not the hegemon, God forbid. We've been there, seen that, and spent a lot for that. No longer. But an indispensable player in Greater Eurasia is the ambition, and of course the world is, that Russia believes is coming, is a world in which the West no longer has the dominant hegemonical position. A very important position, extremely advanced in so many ways, will not be displaced from that, but that's it. And very finally, there are enormous obstacles to realize those ambitions. And most of those obstacles are within Russia. It has not only weak demographics, but it has a political economic system that chains the talents and and abilities of the Russian people. It has a political system that has to go through a crisis each time there's a change of the top leader, and that crisis could be very severe. There's a lot to be said about social cohesion in a country with wide disparities in wealth and position, and a country that does not have much agreement on what should be the values guiding the nation. Russia is standing in front, in my view, of a major, I would call it crisis, with a 10-year horizon, maybe a bit earlier, maybe a bit later. But the Russian Federation, as it is today, in my view, will go down in history to be replaced by a different kind of a political-economic setup in the country. I'm not talking democracy, but a little bit more fairness, a little bit more norms that would apply to all. I think a little bit more justice. Russians don't care about legality that much, but they do care about justice. And justice has been severely violated in the last 20 years. Mr. Putin's, and this is the last thing I will say, Mr. Putin's great contribution to Russian history has been taking the country out of the chaos in which it was in the late 1990s. He built a regime that looks pretty stable, but has its own expiration date. And the challenge before the Russian people going forward is creating a state out of the regime that we have today. We'll see what happens. Thank you very much.